Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's video lecture. This week we'll be talking about the second half of the 20th century. Of course, that's 1950 to the year 2000. All right, without further ado, let's do a quick review. So last week we learned about the first half of the 20th century. The first half of the 20th century was largely a rejection of the conventions that came before it. They were looking for new ways to express these kind of old ideas. So we saw things like polytonal music, polyrhythmic music. The neoclassical kind of style took hold during this time. It solidified ideas and added and livened up these new perspectives. It was all about a new century, a new way of thinking about music. We also saw things like atonality and jazz were coming about and setting the stage for what was to come. So I like to think a lot of times about these movements and these styles in the context of art. I think visual art is a really easy and great way that helps to understand what's going on in music. So during the first half of the 20th century, we have people like Pablo Picasso and the modernist movement who are coming around in visual art. And what we see here is that they're saying, okay, let's look at these old ways of making art, these old ideas about art, and put a new spin on it. There's a second side to the coin. There's a new way of looking at this thing. So you can see here in the red tablecloth from 1927, this is a really old style of painting. Many of you who may have taken a art class at some point or a drawing class have probably had to deal with this idea of perspective, and the way that teachers have taught this idea for a really long time is they will put a bowl of fruit or a couple objects on a table with a tablecloth, and your job is to draw them from your perspective. So as you're looking at it, how do the shadows fall on the objects? Where's the light coming from? How do you make something look 3D in that space? But Pablo Picasso and a lot of the modernists came about and they said, okay, that old way of looking at things is played out. What is a new way that we can look at the same idea of things on a table, but instead of the traditional way of looking at perspective, we're going to have our own idea of perspective. So here's the same old idea, but a new way of looking at it. And we kind of saw that at the same time in music, right? So there are these old, very stable ways of looking at rhythm, or traditional ways that have evolved of looking at tonality and harmony, and they said, oh no, we're throwing all that out. We want to look at these same ideas but in a new way. So that's what we see at the first half of the 20th century. To continue with this kind of arts analogy, in the second half of the 20th century, we see visual artists begin to ask or to say a whole new thing. So whereas the people in the first half were saying, what's a new way of looking at this old thing? There's a new spin on this old idea. In the second half, we kind of have the postmodernist, here represented by the pop artist and by Andy Warhol. Many of you will probably recognize the Campbell soup cans. So these folks, they were criticizing modern society, and they were using popular media or things from people's everyday lives, repetition, to do this. So the postmodernists, rather than saying, let's look at that old idea and here's a new way to think about it, they were saying, no, 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 no. You're asking all the wrong questions. It's not, what is the best kind of art, or what's the best way to portray this idea? They're asking a more fundamental question. What even is art to begin with? What are these large institutions in our lives? How do we make meaning out of the bigger ideas? So again, not what is the best kind of art, or what is the most true kind of art, or what is the most beautiful thing, but what even is art? What is beauty? What is perspective? They're looking at these objective claims and saying, oh no, all of that is naive. You don't realize kind of the bigger forces that are at play here. So that's what we see, this kind of abstraction, a further abstraction from the period before it. As we've noted many times, whether in music, visual art, dance, architecture, philosophy, so on and so forth, so often we see movements as reactions to the preceding movement. And so this was another example of that. So, how do we see any of this represented in music? Also, I should have said this at the beginning. The idea of a single lecture on the entire second half of the 20th century, I think, is a bit absurd. So instead of focusing on, the important artists of the time, or instead of focusing on, the music that was most indicative of this time, instead I'm trying to focus on some bigger themes, because honestly, you're going to find a lot of your favorite music, between the years of 1950 and 2000 completely left out of this lecture. Most of my favorite music from this time is completely left out of this lecture. But I'm trying to just draw some lines between important ideas or important concepts or important technologies that came around during this time that had an effect on a wide range of the art that was being produced, the music that was being produced. So I say here, rather than try to tackle the vast array of musical invention during this time, spanning rock and folk and hip-hop and rap and Motown and pop and on and on and on, I will instead focus on three areas which I feel are integral to the styles of the time and the trajectory towards modern music, which is what we're going to look at next week. So these three areas are electrification, recording technology, and sampling. And I think these three things are really important ideas to understand this time in music. So first up, let's talk about electrification. So we talked about jazz a little bit in our last lesson. And what we noted with jazz, and you can even kind of see this concept of, instrument evolution going on in the preceding several hundred years with orchestral instruments. But what we notice is there's always this idea of bigger sound. As some instruments develop, they tend to drown out other instruments, and then those instruments have to become louder to compete with the first ones, and then everybody else has to get louder. It's like this, this complex where everybody's constantly getting louder and louder. I've commented on some of your writings. You should look into Murray Schafer and his ideas about the sonic ecology and this kind of thing about how our world is getting louder. But anyways, so instruments are getting louder, and it was really hard, especially for guitar players at the time, to compete. You got a little acoustic guitar, which if you're playing by yourself is totally sufficient for a small audience, but when you're trying to compete against a loud brass band, woodwind instruments, big drums, it's impossible. You're totally going to get drowned out. So there were a few attempts to make the guitar louder. So we see around the 1900s, people start to experiment. We start to get steel wound strings, which increase the sound of the instrument a bit. And we even get the steel body guitar by the 1920s. Some people call it the resonator guitar. So at first, you just get kind of this metal drum resonator that's in the center of the guitar, which makes it louder. And eventually, you see guitars completely built out of steel, which again makes that instrument louder, makes it able to produce a louder sound to compete with the bands that they're playing with. But it's still acoustic at that point. We're not plugging it up into anything. It also really changes the tone of the instrument. I think it'd be helpful to think of these as two completely different sound worlds. But by the 1930s, we start to get electronic amplification, and it proves to be one of the most successful innovations for bringing a louder sound to the poor, struggling guitar players. Around 1931, Beauchamp and Rickenbacker produced the electromagnetic pickup, which you can see, I'll circle with my mouse here on Mr. Presley's double-necked guitar here. So there's three of them, his hands covering up a fourth. And they, by the 1940s, we have Les Paul and Fender and Bigsby. All of these names, I'm sure those of you who play guitar will recognize are still relevant to this day, who started producing their own line of electric guitars for consumers. These were quickly adopted by musicians, and their sounds appreciated by many audiences. Suddenly, the guitar could compete and could become a prominent instrument in new music. Instead of the horn section being the most important part. Now all of a sudden the guitar, the humble guitar, could compete and could take center stage because it was loud enough now. We also kind of in the second half we start to have the idea of the synthesizer comes to light. We often call it just a synth. It's an electronic musical instrument that generates audio signals that can be converted to sound. Completely electronic. Whether analog electronics that we see at the beginning of the 20th century or towards the end when we start to see digital, completely produced through electronic means. Synthesizers, some try to imitate traditional instruments. So if you look at maybe when you were a kid, you might have had an old Casio keyboard and it had all these different buttons you could press, and there were some that tried to sound like a banjo or a piano or an organ or a guitar or whatever, flutes and so on. But some are producing what we think of as completely electronic sounds. So sounds based on sine waves, square waves, sawtooth waves, etc., or more complex waves. Yeah, and so we get all kinds of different things. The theremin up here with Clara Rockmore, and I invite you to watch this video, it's great. The Cesson Swan plays on the theremin. It was played completely hands-free, so the joke is, what is one instrument you can play without ever touching it? It's the theremin. So it has two poles. You can see her left and right hand are close to them. One of them, as your hand gets closer or further away, controls the pitch that you're playing. And then the other one, as your hand gets further or closer, controls the volume. And so it creates these weak electromagnetic fields around these two poles, and then your hand disrupting that field gives the machine the information it needs to create the sound. The theremin, many of you will know from Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys, the very kind of unique sound in the background. That's it. I think I have it linked at the end, so hopefully all of you have heard that song. If you've not, gosh, I wish it was my first time hearing it. What an awesome tune. The first widely recognizable and influential keyboard synthesizer was created in 1964 by Bob Moog. The Moog factory you can actually go find in Asheville, North Carolina. It's really cool to take a tour if you ever get a chance when you're up in Asheville. It had an incredible impact on the music industry. It was widely adopted by Stevie Wonder, Parliament Funkadelic, Gary Newman, many others through the 60s and beyond. Really, it's just completely changed the face of music and the way that we think about what sounds are acceptable to our ears. This is a great video about a machine, a big, large modular synthesizer called Tonto that Stevie Wonder used on Superstition and several of his other tunes. Very interesting documentary, short. I encourage you to watch it. So what about recording technology? We've got all these great instruments, right? Electric basses and guitars. We've got synthesizers. But it doesn't really, it kind of, we want to record these things for posterity. We want to be able to share this music with future generations. So how are we going to go about that? In the 1950s, we saw recording technology. So the vinyl records, the magnetic tape, we can take all of these new sounds that we have and preserve them and share them with audiences all over the world. So thanks to the invention of these two methods, musical reproduction was easier and more cost-effective than ever. And that's a really big thing, more cost-effective. With these units, which of course were still very expensive at their time, but with these units that could fit on a desk, you could record yourself. You didn't need, an entire big building or a company behind you. You could do it yourself. And so we start to see people taking the risk of buying these and opening up their own studios and creating music in their local communities. So magnetic tape led to the release of the hi-fi stereo recording for the general public, which was really cool. You see on the old Les Paul, Mary Ford albums that they start to experiment with tape recording, kind of doing multi-track recording where they'll layer multiple sounds and re-record them over the same piece of tape, and they would call them virtual ensembles. So yeah, you could record multiple people singing all on the same individual tape track and then add something else on top of it. It's like early layering. like we might be used to if you have a digital audio workstation that you use now, like GarageBand or something. These techniques allowed for greater sophistication of popular music. Gifted composers were accessing tape now as an interesting way of playing with music, recording over things, overdubbing, abstracting from original sound and doing strange things with it, which we see in this documentary here from the BBC. I think this one was created in the 1970s. But basically, avant-garde composers got a hold to the tape machine. Pierre Schaeffer, as far back as the 1940s, was playing around with magnetic tape. And we start to see them, as people like Terry Riley and Stockhausen, utilizing tape to do something that was new in music, something you'd never been able to do before. If I wanted to have a concert, I had to have all the people in the same room, or even if I wanted to record you all on some kind of old phonograph or something, I had to have everyone stand around in the same place. We all had to be in the same place, and I could record us all at the same time. But with magnetic tape and with this layering system and with manipulating tape in different ways by cutting it and reversing it, you could create sounds that no one had ever heard before. I could take sounds that I recorded from people in various places all around the world and then compile them into a single recording that one person could listen to. So you could hear the sound simultaneously of people in several different places. This allowed composers to play around with ideas of space, to create spaces like our ears we're not used to hearing. We're typically, when we hear sounds, used to hearing them all coming from a single point of origin or a single room that we can understand. But hearing, more and more complex ideas of many sounds coming from many different places all at the same time can be a bit of a disorienting thing for someone listening to that for the first time. In popular music, tape was used to create really psychedelic atmospheres. We start to see tape delay, or people manipulating tape by playing it slower or faster than it was intended to create these kind of really long sounds. If you play it slower, or really fast chipmunky type sounds. This again, great video. I highly encourage you to watch it. He goes through the entire process of recording a few sounds, cutting the actual tape with a razor blade, and flipping the tape around backwards so you get two sounds that are the right way around and one that's completely backwards. Interesting stuff. I could dive into it all day, but I'll spare you. In 1975, we start to have the digital era coming around. Sony is creating PCM1 audio units. We can record an all digital recording now for the first time, and in 1979 on the album Bop Till You Drop we have the first example of that. In 1982 the compact disc CD, co-developed by Sony and Philips, was released, and it was the most advanced means of listening to audio playback at the time. It's supposed to have the highest fidelity, the best sampling rate. The physical size was much smaller. You could store these things in a really small area, and so you could have a huge music library that didn't take up a whole bunch of space. But also, the idea was it was supposed to have the best fidelity, the best quality when you were listening back to it. All right, as we wrap things up, the last big idea I want to go over is sampling in popular music. So we talked about Pierre Schaeffer and how he, in some of his music, would take various recordings from many different places and layer them on top of each other or utilize them in different ways. This, theoretically is the idea of sampling. Sampling has a lot of different terms when it comes to audio engineering and digital sound. But in this particular usage, we're thinking of taking a sound from one place and then reusing it for a different purpose in another place. I might like the drums on this particular song, and I can sample those drums and use them in my own song. Or I might really love a piece of the guitar solo on this other song, and I can take that piece of the guitar solo, remove it, and sample it and add it to whatever project I'm working on. So taking samples, pieces of sound that was recorded elsewhere, and then reusing it, kind of like an audio collage or something. So, starting in the 1970s, we see this idea begin to kind of hit mainstream. So, we see hip hop as we know it today being born in the Bronx in New York. We have DJ Kool Herc, aka Clive Campbell, experimenting with his family's turntables. His family had these turntables downstairs. And some old records, and so he starts playing them, and then he starts, one day, the story goes, whether this is true or not, I do not know, one day his mom was calling down from upstairs. He puts his hand on the record to stop it because he couldn't hear her, and he hears this amazing scratch, the quintessential record scratch that we all know very well today. And that started it all. He realized, whoa, that's a cool sound I can make by manipulating the turntable as it spins with my hand, moving the record in a direction it wasn't meant to go, slowing it down, looping, so I can push the record back to a point that I like. If there's a 3-second, 5-second loop of drums or something that I really like, I can spin that turntable back around continuously, so I continue to play back those drums over and over. And the art of scratching was born. It gave lots of recognition at block parties. People would bring all their favorite records out and they try to mix these things together. They find different pieces of different songs that worked well together, and use this technique of scratching to kind of develop the art form. As the parties grew, they required a master of ceremonies, aka an MC. That's why we get lots of folks who call themselves MC blank. That stands for Master of Ceremonies. And eventually people begin, once you get like a really good groove going, once you get a few really cool layers that are going over the top of each other, people want to rap over the top of it. Before you know it, we have what is, today, one of the most popular forms of music in the world, definitely one of the most profitable forms of music in the world. So eventually, artists begin to embrace the digital. So we see the Roland 808, very popular drum machine, or the Akai MPC, which allows you to sample not on a turntable, not with magnetic tape, but completely digitally in this wonderful box. The MPC is still very popular today. Been used by everybody from Jay Dilla to Kanye West, on and on and on. The sound of modern day hip hop, modern day rap as we know it, completely dates back to the MPC, the 808, and Kool Herc in his family's basement with the turntables. So cool. I put an example of one of Pierre Schaeffer's compositions here from 1948. And then on the opposite side, I put a piece by Afrika Bambaataa and Soul Sonic. At first glance, you're going to think these things are so different. They don't have anything to do with each other. But I would encourage you to think deeply and think about how that music was constructed and see what you come up with at the end. I wonder if you find that maybe these two things aren't so different. Maybe they utilize similar techniques. Here's our key terms. Musique concrète, amplifier, turntable, synthesizer, sampler. And of course, like always, I've got what I hope is a very enjoyable listening example set here. Again, I tried to deal with those three main areas: the electrification, recording technology, sampling. I try to have a good smattering of all of those here. So we get examples of early types of recording. We get examples of digital recording on here. We have examples of electrification with Elvis Presley and Bob Dylan. We get examples of hip hop, Grandmaster Flash, the Furious Five. Synthesizers, Gary Newman here. Buggin' Out by Tribe Called Quest. Excellent example of 90s sampling culture. So I hope you find something great here that you like. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at kyle.berry@hgtc.edu. I hope you have a great week. Bye.